Welcome to our public health webinar series, Motivational Leadership, Are You Ready to Change? We're brought to you through the Atlantic Emergent Technologies and Industrial Hygiene Training Center, which is a joint project between the CUNY Graduate School of Public Health and Health Policy, the Universidad Metropolitana School of Environmental Affairs, and the Rutgers University School of Public Health. We've been funded through the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences, and this presentation is brought to you through that center. So throughout the program, you can ask questions. You'll go through the chat box, and if you don't see the chat box on your screen, click on the three buttons down at the bottom, and that should open up a little menu, and click on the chat there, and your chat box should open up as you see there. So you can type in questions at any time during this presentation. So if a question comes to mind as we're going, please type it in there, and we'll get to them at the end. So we will have time to do that, so feel free to do that. Our program has social media presence. So our program at the School of Public Health, Center for Public Health Workforce Development, you can see our Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube channel, all Rutgers Training branded. And this is in cooperation with the University of Washington Continuing Education Program in the Department of Environmental and Occupational Safety and Health. And you can see their Facebook and Twitter feeds. So we're very happy to bring this program to you today. We have Molly Brycey Cox, who is our speaker today. She is at the University of Washington Michael G. Foster School of Business, and she's going to talk to you today about motivational leadership. Are you ready to change? So Molly, welcome.
Thank you so much. What a great honor and privilege it is to have the opportunity to talk today about things that are really important. In particular, as you are facing a lot of challenges with designing for safer chemicals today, safer processes, and so we're going to talk today about how to think about those types of changes and motivating leadership in such a way as to be successful. So thank you, Mitchell, for introducing me. I am a native of Seattle. I have over 25 years in change management experience. And some of that experience has been in some significant periods of transition in business and technology. And so it gives me an opportunity to share about some of the things that I learned and things that I'm confident you're facing in your world today as you're moving towards healthier environments and away from more detrimental chemical usage and exposures. So today is going to focus on providing you with some theoretical and some practical ways of thinking about the changes that you'll be facing this next year and through the future. So I've been with the Foster School for almost 5 years. I work in the Center for Leadership and Strategic Thinking. My focus is on leadership and team development, and I work directly with Dr. Bruce Avolio, and Dr. Bruce Avolio is one of the world's recognized scientific researchers in leadership development. So let's start talking about what's happening in the world today for you. And so I gave you some examples of things that I know are just diverse scenarios of the challenges today. So I know that there's a lot of issues around chemicals and industries. For example, one of the earlier podcasts I watched gave the example of the construction industry and the use of all the chemicals that are made used to make concrete. There was also examples of bathtub refinishers and exposure to methylene chloride. We know that products contain urethane formaldehyde and that we need to change those and use greener options. And there's issues with home healthcare and cleaning solutions. These are examples. I've had the opportunity to participate in the Peter A. Brycey Endowment at the University of Washington School of Public Health. And the last 2 years, for example, we had guest speakers, for example, Dr. Patricia Stewart, And she led the exposure assessment team on a study of the potential health effects and hazards involved in the cleanup of the Gulf of Mexico oil spill in 2010. This year we had Margaret Quinn, who spoke on the health and home safety of home care workers. So this impacts all of us in all different types of industries and in all different types of jobs. And so let's check in then on thinking about an approach to change that may be practical for you. So I want to start and share with you what the definition of developmental readiness is. Often we focus on advancing ourselves in ways that might necessarily solve a problem, but might not necessarily make us ready for what those changes are. So developmental readiness is comprised of both our individual differences and our organizational structure factors. So these reflect the extent to which organizations and members are inclined to accept, embrace, and adopt a particular plan. And this involves the degree to which those who are involved are primed, they're motivated, and they're capable of change. So for me, what brought me to this space of research was, after 25 years of participating and leading large-scale change, I wanted to understand better why some changes were more successful than others. So let's start to think about change. So when you are out in the field or you're doing work in a lab, part of the thing, or you're in the workplace and you're trying to influence changes around chemical usage, it's important for you to think about what are the types of change that you're initiating. And so I'm going to offer us to think about change from the perspective of first order change, second order change, and third order change. And then we're going to share and talk about what does it mean to be technical versus adaptive in your change. And so we're going to think about what type of change is necessary to provide the safer chemicals in your workplace. And they may be different based on what you're doing, where you are, and how the support shows up for you. So for me, one of the great learnings was that when I was thinking about successful change in the workplace, often I noticed that the change that was the easiest to do were the ones that simply required me to do something with the existing structure. And it was more about making a change or actually doing the job. So first order change refers to an extension of past practices. And it focuses on doing a better job about what is already done. So first order change might be as simple as going out on the internet and looking at what other chemicals can be an alternative and be replaced for a more greener experience. So open up the chat box and share with me what changes can be made for providing safer chemicals today that are an extension of the work that you're doing today. So do you see these first order changes that are relatively simple for you to execute on? And if you do, feel free to share those in the chat box. So let's move on and think about what is the next level of change. So now we get to second order change. So second order change is related to a more complex change, and it's really about changing the systems that are underneath what it is you're trying to accomplish. So it's changing paradigms, requires new knowledge and skills. And so second order change creates a new way of thinking and very often may involve a new way of learning something. So it is often also executed through the use of an informal system. So what changes can you make to use safer chemicals, which will require new knowledge and new ways of doing things? Can someone from the audience give me an example of how they thought about something differently and were able to integrate new knowledge and come up with a solution that allowed you some success in going to a more greener environment? Who would like to share something? We've got kind of a quiet set of folks that are out there, but feel free to engage. I know this is a webinar and a podcast. Your input also makes it more interesting, so don't be shy. So when you think about second order change, often second order change, let me go here, oops. I'm sorry, I'm moving my, second order change often requires the support and conscious advocacy for changing. So in this case, it means that not only do you need to see this change as important, but also not your peers and your organization need to have that same perspective. I'm going to the chat. Is there a way to turn on the closed caption? I'm going to ask Mitchell that. Second order change also requires making a new judgment regarding what's best for making green changes. So first order change is really just about doing your job, and second order change is really about thinking about how to change the systems underlying that provide you the support for learning and making new changes. So second order changes are a little more difficult to arrive at. And often they require looking at what's transpiring and following the process which I've seen outlined in a lot of your other podcasts for how to actually execute changes on safer chemicals. So for example, there's an evaluation and there's an identification process. So those are examples of things that you're going to do in order to arrive at a second order change. And second order changes often require collaboration and the support of the others that are in your space. So to put that into perspective, let's move into what third order change is, and then we can wrap that around the things that you're doing in your workplace. So here's where things showed up for me in a different way. So first order change is about doing your job. Second order change is about changing systems, knowledge, and learning. But third order change is about change from the inside out. This is about culture change. And it's an approach where instead of advocating and directing, it's really about inquiry and examination. And third order change also has an element of willingness to question our changes and our beliefs in our culture at all times. Yeah, so getting the buy-in from the people who you're going to work with really is a second order change. Where third order change comes in, it's about having the culture where you're prompted and promoted to be able to look at these things in order to examine what the culture or the organization can contribute for helping you. So third order change requires organization members to develop the ability to determine for themselves when second order change is required. And it challenges existing ways of thinking and practice. So for me, this is where things turned the corner when I was in the workplace. I found myself very successful in being able to solve a first order change. I really enjoyed the second order change space where you got to think about things differently and potentially come up with new solutions or learn something in order to do it. Where I stumbled was in thinking about cultural change. And so I was focusing on things that were more culturally oriented. For example, a cultural orientation is around sustainability. It's around promoting safety in the workplace. And those are maybe grassroots movement, however, they absolutely require the culture to support it. So that was the key for me in finding where things were less successful, was that first and second order changes often came more easily, but third order changes were really where the rubber met the road and where the bigger challenges were. So can you, if you think about your workplace, do you see issues around third order change and challenges in your organization with being able to have a culture that supports the work you're doing? So first order change is incremental, and second order change is consists of new ways of thinking. And second order change substitutes a state for a better one. So second order change is going to make your environment more safer. Second order change is about changing chemicals and compounds and makeups and replacing more detrimental chemicals with better ones. However, often continuous improvement is more of a culture change. And while continuous improvement itself is not a state, it's actually a process. It allows you to achieve the state of being safe. So what has an impact directly on third order change is what happens with your organizational culture. So in this particular instance, I have a quote for you by Sohar. Dov Sohar is a researcher who is in public health and focuses on leadership and sustainability. And what Zohar has said is that, in other words, the distinction between what we say and what is enacted is an example of the priorities that are displayed in your organization. So it's of key adaptive significance because only enacted change will inform an employee's behavior, outcome, expectancies. So that's a long way of saying that it's about congruency between what we say and how we act. And so if you're in an organizational climate where safety is espoused as being important, however, you don't see the action supporting it, you're going to have very little confidence that the organization is actually committed to those changes. And so that's where the things show up in the workplace where it's challenging for you folks, which is you're behind the espousing and you're behind the action taking. However, if those around you and above you are not supportive in that, they don't give you the resources, they don't provide you the access to personnel and information, then it's unlikely that you're going to actually believe that they really truly think that that is important. So I'm going to ask Mitchell to pop up your very first poll question out of 3. And what I want to know is, based on the scale of strongly disagree to strongly agree, how would you say your organization is ready to enact these changes? Has everyone responded? So if folks have responded, can we show the output from that question? Okay, so we've got folks on all of the responses, but what's really interesting is those that strongly agree are in the minority. And there's a lot of folks that neither agree nor disagree. So we can see that for the folks that are on this podcast, that fundamentally you're on the full range of where your organization is on these changes. So if you don't have your cultural support, it's unlikely you're going to be as successful as you'd like to be in enacting these changes. And so we're going to talk a little bit in the next set of questions about how to frame that and think about that as well. So wrapping up change in first, second, and third order, here's a way of quickly seeing why it's important to understand what happens in second and third order change. And it's because the difficulty is of a much higher, when you're in the second order change, it's often about policies and doing something very different, which requires, it's a moderate difficulty, can take, you know, a medium length of time. And those changes are very often irreversible. Third order changes is really at the value. So if you're in a space where there's not as much, it's not considered a value to be a greener, then you're going to really struggle with executing second order changes. Third order changes, because of the nature, are very difficult. They take a long time, and they are very often irreversible. So let's frame, so we now have framed the type of change, first, second, and third order. And now let's talk about how to think about what action you could take or the approach you want to take based on what type of change you're enacting. So this is from Ron Heifetz, and he talks about adaptive leadership and change. And he has two lenses to which he provides you perspective. The first lens is around technical change. And technical changes are just about receiving and using helpful new information. He also talks about adaptive change. And this is where the secret sauce is. And adaptive change is about stretching and doing things in a new way. So Heifetz talks about technical versus adaptive change, where technical change is really focused on expertise, whereas adaptive actually requires you learning something new. Technical change is when the problem definition, solution, and the implementation are clear. And there are many cases where that might not be the case. I know that when you're thinking about going greener, that often it might require actually some scientific research in order to understand you know, what is actually necessary. So you begin to move into an adaptive scenario where change must come from the collective intelligence of everybody at all levels. So truly adaptive change requires support from the entire company, organization you're in. And adaptive challenges are those we do not know how to solve. In fact, we may actually be causing the problem itself. So in many of our scenarios that are exposure related, in fact, that is the case, which is we are responsible for the problem occurring. So let's go through and think a little bit more about technical and adaptive change and how to approach it. So when you're in that first order technical change space, the most important role is to be the expert and focus on solving your problem. Technical changes are those that are already within our expertise, and often we have procedures and norms and things that we already know and test for solving that problem. And often the best ones are giving them to the expert themselves, and they may not necessarily require any collaboration. So technical changes really involve an expert. Whereas once you're in the adaptive change space, there's a distinction in it's not really about solving a problem, it's about designing for an outcome. So there's a difference between I want to find a greener chemical versus I want to design for a safer environment where my employees are not exposed to things that are unhealthy and detrimental for them. So hopefully you can see what the distinction is. So in adaptive change, inquiry becomes an important tool, because what you really need to do is understand what actually needs to change. You need to understand what is that feedback that you're getting. And it's necessary to regulate the distress that we cause as a result of that adaptive challenge. So if you need to learn new things, people can get paralyzed because they can only learn so fast. And I definitely saw this in the technology space. Most folks only had a capacity to learn a certain amount of things around technology. And when we throw when we throw PC language at them and what's the mouse and the keyboard, suddenly the learning changes. And that is absolutely applicable in the space that you're in. One of the things that are important around adaptive change and being successful is that you actually have to have the discipline of watching for signs of things such as work avoidance, whether we're hiding conflicts, and to use those scenarios instead as an opportunity to be more creative. So fundamentally, adaptive change is about giving the work back to the people who are doing it, who are impacted, and in doing so, you build the collective self-confidence. So here's a little graph for you, help you thinking about technical versus adaptive change. So level 1, level 2, and level 3. And often we're in a level 3 and we apply level 2 solutions to it. And so the importance is understanding what type of problem it is in order to make sure that you're actually using either the appropriate technical and analytical solution, or that you're shifting and you realize that actually this is a space that's more adaptive in nature. It's more difficult to solve. And adaptive change often involves second order change in order to adaptive change very often is about second order change and learning to think about the problem very differently. So where do you start? I've given you first, second, and third order change. We've talked about adaptive and technical change. So how does this tie into being developed and ready? So I'm segueing into leadership because culture is very often, and third order change very often happens around the leadership arena. Second order change has to be supported and influenced through leadership. So what I'm showing you here is a blueprint for leadership development that shows you 4 different levels of leadership, starting with the self-leadership level, moving on to the interactive leadership level, the generative leadership level, and then finally by the strategic leadership level. So it's important for you to understand that this is a maturity model, and that through each one of these levels, there is a very specific different set of competencies and behaviors that you enact as a leader that help you be successful. And the most important place we start is this idea about being developmentally ready. So when you think about developmental readiness, to be interested in being a self-leader. And there's different sets of readiness that help you be more successful as an interactive leader, more successful as a generative leader, and more successful as a strategic leader. So it's important to consider that developmental readiness actually continues throughout every single stage. So you'll always want to be examining developmental readiness. So we're going to take a look at that little battery portion of this blueprint to see how does readiness help you and help others in your organization. So this is a narrative that explains what is happening at each of the levels of this leadership. And you can see I've highlighted in green the first level. So the first level actually is about connecting to core values. And this is really important in the space you're in around going greener because it has to be a core value. At level 2, interactive leadership is about the exchange. And so at level 2, that's often where a lot of the success happens in identifying the things that you want to change that are more first order change and helps you engage in order to implement the things you need to do. The generative leadership level is that shift, and this is where adaptive leadership challenges show up, and where when you're in the generative space, you're going to spend more time on adapting the solutions. And this is where it's important to begin to involve the entire organizations. And level 4 strategic leadership is very much about leaders understanding the mission criticality of being focused on a safer workplace. And that has to be inculcated into how they operate and how they operate as a leader. They need to transmit that these things are important in order for you to be successful. So are you and your leaders ready? Because if they aren't, I promise, when you move into second order and third order change, you're going to find that you're going to be at times successful and at times not. And so why do you want to focus on readiness? Well, 80% of change fails today. And research in the 70s and 80s focused a lot on why it was failing. And so there was a lot of research on resistance to change. And what they found was focusing on what was creating the resistance actually didn't move the ball forward. And so research started to change in the late 80s and 90s with Cotter, when he started to talk about changing from focusing on the resistance to focusing on the readiness for the change. And so very often you saw in organizations changes where in program management, there's the beginning of projects included being ready. And in that action of focusing on readiness and shifting from resistance, we started to move the dial on change failure, and we started to see more successes. And so what is readiness? Well, readiness is really about our ability and our motivation to do something. So if you think about the concept itself of developmental readiness to lead, and you look at what it means to be motivated and what are the ability to lead, here are elements that impact our motivation when we're leading and impact our ability to lead. So motivation to lead is very much about our orientation towards learning. So if I'm learning goal oriented or performance goal oriented, if you're working with folks in your organizations that are performance goal oriented, it's about hitting the numbers and it's about achieving the results. Learning goal orientation is about understanding, gaining more knowledge, and having a growth mindset. So if you're in an organization and you're trying to execute these important changes, and you're working with leaders that it's about the numbers, they may actually see the work you're doing as contra to the work that they're trying to do. It's also about confidence. How confident are we that we can lead these changes? How confident are we that we've had these successes in the past? Our motivation to learn to do things different has a huge impact on whether we're going to take action to make change. And are we motivated to lead to make those changes? If your leaders do not have the self-confidence that they need, they may see going into the territory that you're having needs as being a challenge. They may not see their ability to be successful in it. They may not have had success in the past, and as a result, their confidence may be low. You also may have folks that are really not motivated to learn how to do things differently. So the motivation side of leadership very much is what propels us into action. Motivation itself is about making an effort. It's about that effort having a direction. It's about the persistence of that effort and the intensity of that effort. And so if you're trying to get a high level of intensity and focus, and your leadership is not motivated, you're going to have challenges in the space that you're in. So let's also think about the ability to lead, which is the other element of being ready. And these are 4 areas that we know are mission critical as leaders. And emotional regulation, taking different perspectives, metacognitive awareness, how well do we know how we think? And then self-concept clarity. So self-concept clarity is where all the values are. And if a value of safety is not held as important, then you're not going to see your leaders and your organization execute and increase that ability so that they're more effective. And you're going to have to get folks to think differently. You know, metacognitive awareness is how am I thinking about that, and do I have the means to which I need in order to be successful in thinking differently? You know, do I have the support of others? Do I have the resources that I need to lead and to make these changes? Taking different perspectives absolutely requires a deeper understanding of the impact of what's happening on other people. So you have to be able to take the different perspectives of your workforce in order to understand what things they're being exposed to. Where might there be safety issues that you might want to consider? And then finally, there's an emotional regulation around this, because this is a space where people feel very passionately. These are issues of often life and death. And so you really do need a leader who has the ability to emotionally maintain and regulate, so that you don't have folks over here who are constraining and don't appear to care, and you don't have folks on the other end where they're so worked up about things, others actually can't hear them. So our readiness has everything to do about our motivation and our ability. So what I'd like Mitchell to do is pose the second question, which is, the leaders in our organization are motivated and have the ability to make the change is needed. Do they? Do you think they are? Let's go ahead and answer that poll question. So Mitchell, when you think we've got all the responses, let's go ahead and see what folks think. Holy smokes. So, whoa, well, we've got quite a bit on the agree, but we've also got no one who strongly agrees that their organization is ready. Okay. We've got some folks that are, we've got 18% who is in the disagree, and a lot of folks that neither agree nor disagree. This might be worthwhile spending some time getting an understanding, because you may spend a lot of effort attempting to execute a change when your leadership isn't motivated to do that. So you should find out early if there's a lack of motivation, how to think about how you might increase that motivation. Let's go to poll question 3. I'm motivated to have the ability to make the changes needed. So are you motivated, and do you have the ability? Let's go ahead and show what our panelists think about their own motivation and ability. Rock on. All right. So this is a little upside down as compared to how we see the organization and the organization leaders. So it's feasible that there could absolutely be a gap in how your leaders are motivated. And if they have that ability, is the change of value for them? How are they thinking about those changes? So I can tell you right now, just based on your poll results, that it's highly likely that you may want to spend some time thinking about and understanding the level of motivation and gauging where the ability of your leaders in your organization are to execute the changes that you're going to need. So, as we get ready to wrap up, I want to identify what's involved for you. What do you need to learn about green chemistry, and why and how are these important for you? What resources and tools could you use to transition to safer chemicals? Who needs to be involved, and what decisions need to be made? Ask yourself these questions and ask them of those around you. So, are there any questions you'd like to pose as we wrap up? Well, as we close out the session, I'd like to bring it back to the big picture, which is understand the change you're trying to make. Know that there are different ways of thinking about the approach to those changes. And also understand what is your motivation and your ability when you think about stepping into leading for these changes, and frame your leadership and your organization from the context of their motivation and their ability. And hopefully I've provided you some practical food for thought, as well as some theoretical underpinnings for how to think about executing change in a world where you folks are really facing some uphill challenges, not only in the complexity of the chemistry, but also the complexity of the human dynamics in the workplace. So understand the change you're trying to make. What's your best response? And do your leaders and organizations have the ability and the motivation to make these changes? So with that, I'd like to thank you all. I'm going to double check the chat session really quickly, but I can see from that my leaders, not so much, but I am. Motivated, yes. Ability, not so much. And then how do you motivate the leaders to change? So the challenge around motivating others would require a whole conversation totally devoted to the next level of motivation. But there's a number of ways where you can motivate the leaders in your organization. One is through setting goals. The other is through them, it's got to be around values and an agreement and a shared purpose in this space. So spending time to come up with that shared purpose will pay off for you in the long run. Thank you so much for the honor of presenting this material to you today. You're always welcome to send me an email if you have any follow-up questions. And with that, have a great afternoon.